Welcome, everyone. We're delighted to have you here today. My name is Latanya Sweeney, and I'll be your host for this event. I'm a faculty member here in the Harvard Kennedy School and in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. This event is a launch of a new book, the first book that sets the course for an emerging new study of technology in the public interest. While the launch today is a huge step forward, we do recognize that we are building on the shoulders of many others who over the last decade have provided the guidance and thought leadership that has really been able to help us tackle technology society conflicts. But the launch today is an inflection point that allows us to be able to do that much more at scale in a much more focused way. Here at Harvard, this is also the launch of our new public interest tech lab, which makes technological infrastructures, gadgets, algorithms, know-how, and supporting resources available to faculty, students here and at more than 30 universities around the country. I'm joined by Jim Waldo, Bruce Sneyer, and many others here in the leadership of that lab. I had the great opportunity to be the Chief Technology Officer at the FTC. And when I came back, I had the opportunity to work with undergraduates and other faculty where we started the Tech Science program. And the Tech Science program, the students have done amazing things, which have also laid bricks for getting us to where we are today. A lot of their works has changed business practices, had laws inspired by it, or changed regulations. And today we're honored to have the opportunity to talk with leaders in this space, those who are really shining a light and guiding us forward. So let me turn this over to our public interest technologists. We're going to give a couple of them before we get to the main authors and to David Eaves, who will be talking with them. I just want to let you know that this recording is being broadcast by C-SPAN. So if you speak, you are agreeing to be recorded. At this moment, let me turn it over to the public interest technologist, Kathy Pham, who will tell us a little bit more about herself.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you, Dr. Latanya Sweeney. Speaking of this book, building on so many other work, we have one of the original public interest technologists here with us, and Dr. Latanya Sweeney, who's, I think, has inspired so much of our own work and how we think about bringing together computer science, technology, engineering, design, and government. So thank you for hosting us today. I am Kathy Pham. I am a fellow and faculty member here at the Harvard Kennedy School. I teach a class on product management in the public interest. So what that means is how do we think about product concepts at their core? So things like metrics and users and stakeholders, but weave in a public interest and responsible lens on everything that we do. And it's been really an amazing journey to be able to do that and bring together experiences across the nonprofit sector, the private sector, the government, where I was at USDS in the White House for a few years, and really do what Hana and Tara are talking about their book, build a collective and a movement of all the people who are thinking about what is even public interest, what is this work across so many different areas, and how it really takes so many of us, both learning from the people who've been doing this work and writing about this work for years and decades. And now we have this big momentum to really push it forward with groups like New American, Ford and Mozilla and others who are really funding this work, and continue to amplify so many other amazing people, especially women and people of color who've been powering this movement for so long. I'm so thrilled to have had a chance to read the original manuscript that this book had and see the ways that it really uplifted so many different voices, and excited. And this is a call. I'll pull a page from the Sid Harrow book. A call for all of you to write your own books too, and excited to see a shelf full of books around public interest tech and what that is and how do we pair technology and justice and equity in this work, and have been really truly inspired by folks like Andreen Soley and Afua Bruce over at New America, who've helped build and run the public interest tech program there as well. So really, Tara and Hana, thank you for being here. And I'll turn it back to you, Latanya.
Thank you very much. We're going to raffle off copies of the book. So many, in fact, that most of you in attendance will be able to get a copy. So stay tuned for that. Now let me turn it over to the public interest technologist, David Eaves, who will introduce the authors and the book.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Eaves. I'm faculty here at the Harvard Kennedy School, where I teach on digital government, digital transformation, which is one reason I'm so excited about this session that we're doing. I've got my copy here. You'll notice many, many dog ears and notes already in it, because one of the things I've been focused on in the last year is working with a group of faculty, about 20 faculty around the world, trying to really define what is a core curriculum course that would teach digital to future public leaders. And this book is just filled with amazing stories that I know and that many of my colleagues that I'm working with are already interested in and are starting to talk about. So this is dog-tiered because for me, every one of these is just a moment of teaching in my class that I get to pull upon. So we're so lucky to have both authors here with us. I think one thing that I'd like just to open up to talk a little bit about is maybe, Hana, you describe yourself as a technologist who became a public servant. I think it'd be so great for our students to hear first a little bit about your story. Like, how did you get to this place where you were writing this book and thinking about these issues?
Sure. First, thanks for, this is such an amazing group. So happy to be here. I took a very long and winding path to get here. Starting in college, I think was like, had there been a public interest technology major, I would have done that. But I think in retrospect, like I kind of was creating that for myself. I was a double major in political science and American culture. And then I also just always had an aptitude for technology and knew that I kind of wanted to follow where it was going. So when I graduated from college, I had done a lot of campaign work in college, and that was my plan, was I'm gonna work on campaigns and be a press person. I liked writing. But I also kind of always had one foot in the tech world. This was in the early 90s, so the internet was happening, and I was like, that's really exciting. I wanna go over there and do that. But also the campaigns, but the campaigns were like, not even beginning to think about technology in retrospect. That should have been a flag, but so I knew that I couldn't do both at the same time at that point. So I followed the internet and went and worked on a lot of first sites that now are just, we don't even think of them as, at the time they were new media. So I worked on the launch of the first CBS News website, the Ford Motor Company website, a million things in the private sector, because I wanted to follow the technology. But at some point after, and I ended up running, I started a user experience and research consultancy in the private sector, and did that work for a very long time. And then sort of reached a point where I was like, I feel like I could do this in my sleep. And, I wonder what happened with that campaign stuff. I'm still in, I always followed what was happening in the news and in government and was interested in that work, but didn't really know how to get into it. And so one of the things that Tara and I have in common is that healthcare.gov was a big pivot point for us. So I was still in the private sector when healthcare.gov launched. And at the time, a lot of the press was like, oh, this is the date. I don't remember, Tara, I'm sure it is seared in your brain. I don't know what it is. This is the date, get ready. It's going to be awesome. And I just, from having worked on a lot of big launches, I was like, this is going to be bad. This is not going to happen the way they think it's going to happen. There is no possible way. And sure enough, we all watched what unfolded. And so at that time, I thought, government seems like they need me. I have a skill set now that would be useful. And I actually started looking on USA Jobs and trying to apply for things, but there weren't roles. My title had changed, even though I was doing the same work all the time. I had been an information architect. I had been a user experience person. I had been a research person, pretty much all the same job title. Thank you, Tara, October 1st. I, looked in USA Jobs, and those were not titles that were people were hiring for in government. And when they were reading between the lines, I could see like, this is not going to be a role for me. So I sort of muddled along in the private sector and started taking on more public sector work, which just happened to come my way. And I worked on a project for the city of New York for 301. And it was such a pleasure and so interesting and so impactful. And I think like the reach was unbelievable. Like the fact that you could build something for all New Yorkers to help all New Yorkers was such a different, the stakes are higher. The work was more, and that just made everything so much more meaningful and interesting. And so I started looking again, like, is there a way that I could move into the public sector? And at that point, USDS, the United States Digital Service, had come into existence. And I knew someone who, Dana Chesnell, who I knew from the UX world. I heard that she'd gone there and I was like, well, if Dana went there, it must be a real thing. So I will, I'll look into it. And I just pulled up the application and applied, even though I live in New York and the job was in DC. And I was like, I don't really know how I'm gonna make that work. I guess I'll just find out. It seems unlikely that I'm going to get it anyway. And then, of course, I did get it. And I had to figure out commuting from New York to Washington. And that was a big, after when I started doing that work, I knew that I would not go back to the private sector, or at least not in my immediate future. And that I just was attracted by the complexity of the problems. And frankly, USDS was really, like, we talk a lot about, I think in the public sector, we tend to hold up the private sector as an example, but USDS was really the first place that I had worked where the user experience was prioritized. It wasn't just like a nice to have, it was like people took it seriously for the first time in my entire career of being like, hi, I'm in the room too. And suddenly people were like, wait, we can't move forward unless there is a designer in the room. And that was just an amazing experience. And so I just knew I wanted to stay in the public sector.
Amazing. And we've been so lucky. We've had Dana Chisnell here teaching our students. So we've been really blessed to have someone of that caliber working with our students. So what's so great, Hana, about your story is how nonlinear it is. How there's this kind of like, there's this journey, and then you're kind of on the outside trying to be like, can I find a way into this thing to help out? And so, Tara, I feel like you're almost like the opposite. You describe yourself as the public servant who became translator. So I feel like you're the person on the inside who's like, I know I need something. Who and what do I need? So maybe can you talk about your journey? Because it's kind of maybe a parallel on the opposite side.
Sure. And I think in writing this book, like Hana and I are not like each other. We believe that we need more of both of these things. Civil servants who speak, who are fluent in tech, and technologists who have a place at the table. And so that's part of the alchemy, I think, of what we try to put into the book. I am a serial campaigner and public servant. I have done this my whole life. To the moment coming out of undergraduate, I took a job with an amazing global nonprofit called the National Democratic Institute, NDI, and I was a small d democratic organizer in Bangladesh and Nepal. I worked on free and open elections and trained alongside an amazing team that worked in 7 languages, Nepalese women to run for village level elections. So if that's not a straight line to a book about technology, I don't know what is. But at its essence, what we worked on in organizing these principles of truly understanding, like, who are you serving? How do you amplify that collective voice? How do you make that heard in a village level election with 30 people living in a village development committee, which would be the case in rural Nepal, is a through line for my career of just making voices heard. And I moved from overseas back to the US and did campaigning and work in Congress, and eventually worked on the passage of the Affordable Care Act, and was offered, after really working on the idea side of the spectrum and how you make ideas become a law, I was offered a very unusual job in the Obama White House, for which I had to interview with the policy councils, the outreach team, and the communications team. This is not your normal White House job. President Obama, an organizer himself, had a real sense that moving from a very impressive data-driven digital campaign, that the way government reached people was not the way kind of campaigns had been run, and that the muscle of government in implementing the Affordable Care Act would be hard to reach, very hard to reach people, the uninsured, which are overwhelmingly young people, communities of color, pockets of rural America. And so a job was created in the Obama White House for what I think people thought was going to be one of the hard problems of the Affordable Care Act, which is we're going to have a product, we're going to have a website, but how will the people we need to reach the most, who we don't reach through our normal government channels, get to the front door? And so my job was to be running a very data-driven, kind of out of the box, the way the government meets you where you are job. Eventually, I got back to that job. But when that requires that when you organize people to come to the front door, in this case, a website, you could get in. And so I kind of fell into the turnaround team, which was run by now COVID coordinator Jeff Science. And so I kind of put my work on hold and scrubbed into the team that was part of crisis management and getting the site back on.
Love it. So I love how these stories, like one is like, I want in, and then I get in and I discover the world is complex. There's an amazing world here inside government that is complex and interesting and has a scale and impactful. And then Tara, for you, I'm in a world that's impactful and meaningful, but I need new tools. And I need people who can help me solve problems in ways that I previously didn't. And so actually the union of the two of you, it comes through in the book. It's really, really beautiful. Maybe actually just talking about the book, can you talk a little bit? Well, first, I feel like the book is great and that it's somewhat in part an implicit critique of policy schools and public administration schools, because it's a little bit of like, we need a little bit more of this, but you can speak to that, but maybe tell me and all of us, what do you want the book to achieve? Like, what's the thing when someone picks it up, what do you want them to take away? What do you want the book to achieve? Maybe Tara, could you lead with that first?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. And it is an implicit critique of policy schools, but we can get to that in a moment. We wrote the book because we saw that some people were having this profound impact on impossible problems. I think Hana and I and Kathy and Latanya saw it in the US government, that there were pockets of people changing things, and what those pockets of people were doing looked different from what other people were doing. So we wrote the book to make that work visible and to expand the body of people who were focusing on users, who were using data in real time. These practices that we describe in the book aren't rocket science. They're also not new. I'm glad to have heard Latanya describe this build on, decades and centuries of work, some of which is highly technical and some of which is anthropological in understanding how humans work. And so I don't know if you remember, David, I went around and I interviewed a bunch of people who were teaching public policy. So I was like, where is it that people learn the things that really help you do? And I found David's case study on SNAP in California, but I found very few examples of cases that were taught in policy schools that really felt to me like modern and real to my experience on a bunch of crises in government. And so our effort was to set out and make visible the work, but really also to lift up the stories of a lot of people who maybe even didn't see each other, folks working at the local level, folks working globally, some people who work for government, some people who work for nonprofits assisting them, and portray this for what we think it is a movement of people doing things differently.
So I'd love to hear that. I just noticed that Manuel Bondicki, who's one of my colleagues who's been working on this kind of global curriculum, has dialed in all the way from Brazil. So just to speak to how, when you talk about it being global and the need for more stories, I know that Manuel and I, that's what we're interested in as well. So we love trying to lift those up. And that just so people on the call aware, many of the stories in here are about what's happening in America, but there really is a global need for this type of work. And there's interest around this, and you'll see it here, just looking around the call, you will see there's people from all around the world who've dialed in this call to hear what Tara and Hana have to say. Hana, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so one thing I'll add is that I have also had a parallel career as a writer and journalist, because why have one career when you can have two? And so when I joined USDS and I started to see the work that was happening, it's beautiful and incredible. And it seemed, and at the time, even at the time, I remember pulling over Sarah Sullivan, who was she was the chief of staff at that point. And part of her role was telling the story of the work that USDS had done so far. And I remember pulling her over and being like, can you have a podcast? Because you're a great storyteller and these are amazing stories and people should know them. And so I think it, even though at the time, the idea wasn't let's write a book about it, but it was clear that there were really transformational things happening and those needed to be lifted up.
So Hana, maybe one of the things that really struck me about the book is just how strong the emphasis is on inclusion on kind of in every part. Like, it's not just that there's a moment here where you talk about inclusion, but really about how it factors into everything from like who's doing the work to who gets included and who gets talked to whom are we focusing on when we deliver the services and when we do the work. I guess one question I have is, what's one thing that you think is public interest technology is doing well to reshape or help push forward the conversation about inclusion, which is so important? And then what's one big risk? Like, what's the thing that maybe is a blind spot or there's a lot of work still to be done?
I'm happy to take this one.
Oh, sorry, Hana. Sorry, I'd thrown to you, but you feel free, either one of you.
That's fine. So I think one of the really lovely things about public interest technology is that an integral piece of it is tapping into what real people's experiences are, and that it's not about like what we wish it were or what we would like to imagine that it is. It's a reflection of reality. And one thing that we talk about in the book is why it is critical that public interest technology teams be diverse and that they represent that diversity represents the lived experiences of people. In the book, we talk about it as being from the neighborhood. And actually I can tell a story that highlights one of the important pieces about this. So this was, I'm going to forget the date, but let's say 5 to 7 years ago, the city of New York decided that they wanted to tackle their rat problem. You have to imagine that this is a thing that comes up every year in the New York City mayor's office. They're like, oh, hey, the rats. So they wanted to tackle the rat problem, and they turned the project over to the mayor's office of data analytics. And as a first step in just seeing like, well, where are the rats? What they did was they mapped the 3-on-1 rat complaints to a map of the city. So there was a person working in the mayor's office of data analytics, Amin Ra Mashariki, who it happened, he was working on this project, and he also had grown up in public housing in Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn and still lived in the neighborhood. So he did the natural thing that you would do when you're looking at a map of what's happening in different neighborhoods. And he looked at his neighborhood and he saw that based on the 3-on-1 data, there were not many rat complaints. So he was at the time working on this very project. He was still commuting back and forth from Bed-Stuy and he was seeing the rats. So he was like, this is weird. So he called a friend of his from childhood who still lived in the projects. And he said, do you not have rats anymore? And his friend said, there are rats. And Amin Ra said, well, why don't you ever call 3-on-1? And his friend said, what's 3-on-1? So what what we loved about that story is that one of the pieces of, so first of all, it was critical for that team in looking at the data to have someone from the neighborhood who could say, oh, actually, this data is not telling the whole story. And the other piece of that is, and this is, we will probably get into this, but the other piece of that is that when you look at the data, it's critical to ask who is not in the data. And because there was a diverse team and in particular, here was somebody who was used to not being in the data, he specifically came to it with that point of view and was able to say, actually, this is not presenting a complete picture.
It's a great story. Just to talk about lifting people up, we had Amin Ra write, with one of our students, write a playbook on how to set up a data analytics group in cities that is available on the ASH website that I will try to find and post here, but he's a wonderful gentleman. Tara, I kind of almost want to give you this pitch again, because I feel like you said you wanted to talk more about it. And since we're not in a policy school, but we are in a policy school at the moment, tell a little bit more about where you think we're falling down and where we need to do more, or what you'd like to see more from us and what we're doing with our students.
I think it isn't that the things that students learn, and this isn't Harvard specific, I think Harvard's far along on really making sure that especially public policy students have experience in working with a client and being in the work. But if you look at the average public policy program across the country, people get, I think, too much economics, not enough to become an economist, the wrong type of data, a lot of data that tells you, a lot of data analytics. You know, in government, if I wanted an economist, I wouldn't grab someone who had 2 years of econometrics. I'd grab an actual economist. So you spend more time, not enough to be economist, but but too much to kind of understand real regression well, how you use that in a lived situation. And these tools that we're describing of data that's real-time instrumentation. How would you understand, you know, so much of the data work that we do is in the federal government. We have amazing data. We're the best curator probably of data in the world. But understanding 2 years later that there's an opioid crisis is not useful. Looking back and seeing an inflection in Ohio of inequality in maternal deaths is not useful. We need to get, if you want to solve problems, you need to be able to see what Jen Palko from Code for America describes as like cockpit data. When you're looking out through the cockpit of an airplane, you can't have it be all black. You need to see that there's a directional arrow that you're headed towards LA, not in New Mexico. And that type of practice on data that's good enough in real time to help you solve problems. You wouldn't grab an average policy student who had a real experience of that. These tools they're not to knock out the old tools. We're going to need economists, but I do think the ability to train students, I do this in my course, who are experts on a topic like SNAP, and I ask them to analyze a form that a human used. It's like my blow your mind experience every quarter to have a graduate student who's an expert in a policy that's never seen the front door for their policy, voting form, tax credit. And so really bringing students into a practice of growing a muscle of thinking about the end user, bringing students into data that allows them to see, is it working, test out something's working or not. And really there are modern practices of creating cultures of learning. So like a lot of the analytics we do and train on don't tell you anything about how to shift kind of the political wins or goals in a place. So those are the three pieces we talk about in the book. There are amazing professors. I have a large number of them on this gathering who do this, between Kathy's class and Latanya's class and your class, but it is not the average norm. You get probably really a grab bag of what management is in government. And most of it is the same toolkit of management that you could have had in the 70s, which feels off. So that is, it's something that I'm dog fooding. I eat what I've tried here. I ran an experimental course at Georgetown, and the students really found it's impactful. I collect data on whether the skills are useful, but I think it's an opportunity. It's not just policy schools. This is the same kind of transformation to the digital age that we're seeing institutions struggle with across the board. And while in the private sector, most of the Fortune 500 companies that were around at the turn of the century are no longer around. We do not have that luxury for Harvard, for the for the Department of Agriculture, for city governments. They're not going to be replaced by a startup, but the transformation is harder than starting from scratch. And so whether it's in policy programs or in the government itself, we're really suggesting that people don't replace what they do, but bring these new tools to bear.
Yeah, there's a real need to upskill. And it's funny, I'm just like looking in the chat, there's so many names that I see and know that I love that are flowing through. Amanda Moment, a former student who is, Amanda Hollick, a former student who is flowing through, and she's currently wrestling, in a local government, trying to figure out how are we going to do these big IT implementations and do the work that we talk about here with limited budget and limited resources, a real challenge. So maybe I want to turn to students in a couple of seconds. I'd like to open the floor up. So if you have a question, feel free to put it in the channel, but please also, raise your hand if you'd like. I'd love to open the floor up to you. Again, just to remind everybody that this is being recorded. And so if you ask a question, you are agreeing to be recorded and to have it be broadcast. And then of course, for it to be a question, please make sure it ends in a question mark and keep it concise and focused so that our wonderful guests can actually target and answer the question. Maybe kind of the kind of closing comment I'd like to ask before I open the floor up is there is a wonderful moment too where you have almost like a lot of caution here about like, it's about public interest technology. Let's not be obsessed about the technology. And there's that great story about, going through the foster care program and figuring out, how do we make it more, how do we help families become parents of foster kids? And then realizing at the end of the day, all we actually really need is to staple a couple of the forms together, and we drop the rejection rates from 70% to 0. What's the message you want to tell students and I think policymakers out there who I think we need to have more interest in technology, but not be overly obsessed with the technology as the magic bullet?
Yeah, I love that story. And I also, I think that's one of the most tangible stories in a way in the book, because my mom loves it. And she's like constantly like, you got to tell the staple story. So the main takeaway from that story is, in government, a lot of technology gets thrown at government in many different ways. From vendors or from outside pressure or from people internally saying, oh, it's just, technology will fix it. So the main takeaway is that an app alone will never solve homelessness. An app will never solve hunger. What we really want people to walk away with is that technology is a tool. It's a great tool, it can be a great tool, but it is rarely by itself the solution. And what is so wonderful about that story is they dug into these, in the foster care application process, this took place in Rhode Island. They knew that the child welfare space, they knew that there were not enough families, there were not enough beds for the foster care, for the number of kids who were in foster care, and they were putting them in group homes, which is not the preferred placement. The preferred placement is with a family. And Rhode Island actually had the 4th highest rate in the nation at the time, where two-thirds of kids in foster care were going straight into group homes. And so, of course, Rhode Island looked at the problem and said, oh, we need more families. But actually, so Marina Nitze, who was previously at USDS and then at New America and is still very doggedly doing this work, she said, well, let me take a look at the process. So what Rhode Island wanted to do is they wanted to throw technology at the problem and say, why don't we just make it faster to get families? What we need to do is focus on recruiting families. And when Marina went and she looked at the process, she saw that actually the problem was not that there were not enough families applying. It was that there was such a significant backlog that the application process was so arduous. It could take 1.5 years for families to get certified to be foster families. And one of the, so she looked at, well, what is slowing down the process? And the the first thing that came up was that there was the application form was on one page, and there was one document, and then there separately was a consent form to contact an applicant's doctor. And because it was on a separate page, the failure rate for sending it in was 70%. 70% of applicants did not notice the form, did not send it in. The form also did not have a place to put a doctor's phone number and address. So when they did send the form in, it didn't provide the information that the state needed to move forward with the processing. So what they did to solve the problem was they stapled the forms together, and the failure rate on returning the form went from 70% to 0. So it's a great story that illustrates so well how sometimes the intervention you need literally can be a staple. It's not, and in fact, if they had digitized that process, what they would have gotten was speeding up more families into the backlog. So if you digitize a broken process, you get a digitized broken process. So it's a great story on digging in.
But one thing I think that your book does so well is it goes further, which is describe the impact on the families, who then said, well, if I get so little support during the application process, and I'm going into doing a task that's bound to be difficult, I wanted to care for this kid, but I want to have support, what support am I going to get when I'm actually in? Like, if it's bad now, how bad is it going to be later? And I felt like that was such a great, again, coming back to this thinking about, focusing on users, inclusion, engagement, was such a great observation. So I'd love to open the floor up. So if you have a question, please use the raise hand feature or kind of chime in on the sidebar. I did actually find a really great, I thought, kind of challenging question from Chizoban a little bit further back. And if they're on the line, I'd love for them to turn on their screen or turn on their audio to ask the question. So I might just wait a few seconds. If not, I'm going to ask it on their behalf because it's not. So I'm going to dive in. They have this great question. It says, is there such thing as a non-partisan public interest technologist? So, when you're engaging with these partners, whether they're nonprofit or partisan, like, do you need to draw lines on who we're engaged with? And I thought this is a very, very important question. So maybe Tara, do you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. And I see an adjacent one, maybe I'll just name, because I think they're in the same vein of someone working with Dr. Sweeney saying, how can public interest technologists handle conflicting priorities from political forces? I think this is a variant of it. So for example, states last year, such as Florida, who have intentionally designed unemployment claim systems to under-resource and discourage claims. I think these are two kind of the same, ethics, similar ethics challenges. So I'll take it and Hana jump in. That it's, there are decisions when you decide who your user is, right? Whether your user is your average user or your user who can't hear, right? So I think inherent in the focus on users, there is some editorializing, which getting out of kind of the pure political space, but that gets to, I think I want to suggest these aren't per se neutral tools. There are determinations even in how you're collecting data and what how you analyze it. On the political side, we really wrote the book. We try to pull in the global context, but we wrote it from what we know best. So we largely feature American stories. And I think in the United States, in a kind of free democratic society, there's a framework in which you can really say, do this neutrally. There are ways to put checks on it. If you're being transparent about what's in your algorithm, and people can come and hold you accountable. I think there's a broader question of how you put these tools to use in governments in an authoritarian context in parts of the world. And so I think in some ways what we describe as fully appropriate and will definitely ground US governments, federal, state, and local in an openness, the same set of tools, I don't want to say theoretically, are actively being used places like China in a capacity that is oppressive. So we put major caution labels on the idea that this is technocratic or neutral. It is about who you aim to serve. And I think our ability to be transparent about when these tools are being used. We tell a story in Michigan about an algorithm, like a kind of an analysis tool sold to the Michigan Department of Unemployment Insurance to seek out fraud that was 99% incorrect. It took years and loss of, life, literally, and lawsuits to check the use of technology in preventing people from getting what was rightly theirs. And so we think this is one of the reasons you need the fluency is, chances of misuse are profound, but that doesn't suggest that we should stop using data in 2021. It means we need to enter with the complexity that the topic deserves.
I'd love to go to a next question. Andreen, I see that you asked, I think is a great question about, who gets counted in this work or who gets included. Do you want to ask that question, Andreen?
Sure. The question I had was, I know that folks traditionally define themselves as technologists or your engineers and your computer scientists. How do they find their way in this work? How do they think about applying their hard skills within a sort of pit frame? What's your sense of that?
Hi, Andreen, that's a great question. So there at USDS, it was sort of common knowledge. A lot of the engineers at USDS would say, I took this job to come be an engineer in government, and I have yet to write a line of code. So I think that realistically, that I think that actually speaks to at the root of public interest technology is actually not writing code. That is a piece of it, but the role that technologists end up playing, what we saw at USDS, and I think what we also seen at New America and in the field is that it's a mindset that technologists tend to be system thinkers. We tend to be people who are trained to ask, well, what is it really that you're trying to do? Because it's very difficult to build a system without asking those kinds of questions and understanding, like, what's the real goal? What do you really want the system to do? What are the levers to move? And so whether that that means that you are then building a technical solution, or you use that same skill set to unpeel the onion and get to the root of the problem, it kind of doesn't matter how that skill set manifests. I mean, it matters if you're someone who just wants to write code all day. Perhaps this may not be exactly the field for you. But I will say that as a researcher and a user experience person, I think that public interest technology does rely very heavily on the research and user experience piece. But that technologists who are who are coders, it's really the systems thinking piece and being able to contextualize, oh, okay, so you want to do X, but really, what do you want to do?
Maybe, Tara, I'd love to actually almost ask the inverse of this question, which is, many of the students who come through policy schools don't have hard technical backgrounds. They're not software engineers. Where do you see them fitting into the public interest technology world, and what's their entry points, and where can they participate effectively?
I think we need, as much as we need more cutting edge data scientists and user researchers and designers and a set of a range of what we would call, technology skills, which are not the same thing, but we've bucketed as needing more of all of the above. We truly need more, policy experts who understand what these things are. Not that they would become engineers or become data scientists, but there are some things that data won't do. And that, like, back to the app, I think one of the challenges of the work is having policy people who understand enough fluency to know who to call for the next click but enough about what data will do and algorithms can and can't do, and enough about what is the difference between purchasing a contract that is agile versus waterfall. And you don't have to be the person who does that, but there is a fluency, vocabulary, and understanding of systems thinking as well that we need to bring into the policy space. So that doesn't mean you need to kind of go to coding boot camp, although I think it's helpful to dip your toes in. And it means really drilling into what works and what doesn't work, and having enough knowledge, as I think a number of folks here teach, about these skills to be a curator of bringing more people to the table.
So fascinating. I'd love to, again, just check to see if there's any hands that want to go up. Anybody want to ask a question? Please do feel free to signal in the chat as well. I'm going to jump in and ask a question while I'm waiting now, which is, one question I have is, we're such a great moment right now. Just the other day, the former president tweeted about your book, which is, I'm sure, was a very exciting moment for you both. Might be nice to talk a little about that. In addition, it seems like there's an administration that really is trying to wrap its head around this and think about how the work that you're writing about folds into the government. If you had the ear of those who were kind of getting ready for the next 4 years, what would you want to extract from the book and kind of inject into the room? How can they capitalize? How can we all capitalize on this moment? So maybe you, Tara, and then Hana, I'd love to hear this.
Sure, I'll say in two parts. One is, nothing demonstrates the need for doing things differently, and how dependent we are on government as a global pandemic and the economic fallout. And so I think some of the case that a number of us have been trying to make about execution, the importance of not just ideas, but how ideas reach people, and how the process of really reaching people should change our policy ideas over time. If a good thing comes from a bad thing, it is our ability to see that we need to execute government differently. Can't just, vaccine dollars weren't a foregone conclusion with Congress, but now that you have them, getting shots in people's arm is the task, right? And not some people's, everybody's arms. And getting the shots in everybody's arms is not the same task. There is no average user of a vaccine, and we need to reach every person where they are. So I think just on the first part, David, the moment helps explain the importance of upping the game on this work. On a more, if I had the ear of these folks, I've had the pleasure to serve for the current president and the former president. And we are profoundly blessed by the fact that President Biden, to his core, is oriented, through his whole career, has been oriented towards how does that really get to someone? How many grocery bags? Anyone who has ever worked for President Biden will say, the calculation of what that costs in groceries dollars would be an exercise that you've gone through as a policy staffer working for Biden. And so this orientation, and President Obama had it as well. I think part of the reason he's receptive to these ideas is, as an organizer, he was constantly pressing us in the Roosevelt Room on, okay, you have a new tax credit, but how would anyone know? How would, I'm on the south side of Chicago, I'm busy, I'm picking up my kids. How would I know? And so I think both of these presidents have an orientation to push towards what it is like for the average person. And that is at its core what you need, that kind of leadership from the top, if you want to bring this, make the muscle of the federal government better at reaching people where they are.
Hana. Oh, you're muted.
I don't think I have anything to add to that. That was really beautifully put. Thank you, Tara.
Kathy.
I want to channel the 2 direct messages people sent that have a question, asking if Dr. Sweeney could share some of her thoughts as it relates to what others have said already around investigation plans with students and the work you do with students that are related to what the speakers have talked about.
Yeah, well, so, there are many ways to engage in public interest technology. And one of the things we do here with students is we take you, no matter what your discipline, and show you how your discipline, that lens, can have a big impact on a particular technology society conflict. One of the tools that we've been using, the idea of what we call investigation plans. And it's really the idea of being able to take one student who says, I see this conflict, I see this problem, I see sort of this unforeseen issue, and they actually write about it in a way that another student can come later, or other students can come and actually try to do scientific research from their disciplinary perspective, or build technology from their perspective to demonstrate or prove that point, to add the public interest view on the conflict that was raised. The investigation plans we think that they're going to be extremely powerful and helpful, primarily in the space of saying, what are the problems that we're having with technologies? So you guys are doing a great job. I mean, and the space of problems are so broad. Some of the comments try to keep narrowing it down when it's really the opposite, right? And I don't know who asked that investigation plans. It's probably one of my students that's on the call, but yes, that's yet another way that to engage.
Actually, I think the secret hand is Andreen, who is very, very keen to learn more about how you're connecting your work, your invaluable work, to what the students are doing. We're coming up in the last few minutes, so I think I'd love to just turn back to Tara and Hana and just kind of open the floor to you. You know, where do things go from here? Like now this book is out, the work's going on. What would you like to see happen to the field of public interest technology? Like, where should it go? What do you want to see happen? So maybe Hana, you first, and then we'll close with Tara.
Well, so even though these practices have been around for a long time, it's the combination of them is new. And I think with a new field, we are all feeling our way. We have seen a huge explosion in the field in the last 4 years, really, with a significant number of teams cropping up and more people. And actually, we were having a conversation earlier about how we went at the beginning, from the beginning of this work, to being like, does anyone need some help? To now just an onslaught of, okay, how do we get all of this work done? Which is a fantastic problem to have. But I think, so one of the things that we have been doing at New America is trying to take a look at, as the field evolves, where are the holes, where are the places that need some help or some connective tissue. So that's for sure one of the pieces. There are a tremendous number of people who've come to this field who are attacking the problem from all angles. So I think it's hard to say one is more important or more valuable than the other, because we're still kind of learning and seeing what works. One of the reasons that we wanted to write this book was to, at the very least, make the work visible and say, look, this is a thing that is happening. Come join. It's an exciting moment. So exactly how, I mean, that can look very different depending on what problem you're trying to solve, what level of government you're talking about. I will stop rambling on that. I'm sure, Tara, you have.
I'll jump in on where it's going and also try to pull on a few questions in the chat about opportunities that people see, whether you're in health, and also I think a thread from Kathy and a few others about this technologist and non-technologist divide. So let me see if I can do all those in one, which is, first, if you want to solve problems, whatever your trade is, this is for you. You don't have to, I studied urban planning. That's highly technical. I would never call myself a technical person. We need more public problem solvers in companies, in government, and I mean all form of government, in nonprofits. And we need to broaden the set of who sees themselves in that work. And until we do, we are not going to fix it. That is sort of, Amin Ra's story, that the breadth of who can see themselves in this work is an integral part into who can be in the work, and the work, we will not fix our problems until we can broaden the circle. Both that is technical training and just walk of life. So I want to like, if you're listening here and you're wondering if this is you or for you, yes, period. You know, that's the aim of what we're trying to do here, is create the space. And I think, how do you get in? Since Dr. Sweeney is generously sharing books with folks, we tried to make it, we were like, oh, maybe people are going to get excited and want a map. So we made like a map that will surely be outdated in the time it takes Princeton University Press to publish a book, but like links and resources of where to go find some organizations, not the wealth of organizations. Part of why we tell stories about a kind of tiny design shop in Michigan called Sevilla, and a group that doesn't consider itself per se to be public interest technologist community solutions that works on ending homelessness around the globe, is to give people a sense of where you might go apply your skills to problem solving. And I think if we're at 2.0 when we were at 1.0 in the Obama days or in the early UK days, the aim is that we almost get to a point where there is no longer a brand for this. Like, we don't first, I describe this as like the first round of it, you have like a job and a person who's like a CDO or a CTO or a data scientist. And then pretty soon you realize we're going to need a team. We're going to need a whole unit of those special skills. And then you're like, nobody knows how to put those folks to use. We're going to need to upgrade what a policy expert is. But like 3.0 is, this is how we do it. You know, we engage more deeply with the humans we're serving. We use data and we have cultures of learning. And so that we get to a point where the field is just like how government works. I think that is Hana and my aspiration. We're in the phase where we need to show it and explain it and name it and grow it. But I think the ultimate goal is that what we conceive of as the next generation of chief of staff or policy expert, or what a government agency looks like, this is everybody's work, this type of practice. And that's our transparent aspiration for what it's going to take to solve the kind of problems that we face.
And it's just a beautiful way for us to close out. I just want to remind everybody, the name of the book is Power to the Public. If you're not lucky enough to get a copy here from us, you should rush out and get one if you have not already. Strongly encourage you to do so. An absolute wonderful read. Again, note, I'm already marking up like mad. And I just want to say thank you to our two guests for taking time to come to us today and having such a rich conversation with us. And thank you for the students for asking such great questions. Thank you, everyone. Please be safe and please be good. And I hope to see you all soon.